When 21-year-old Emma loses her parents, she trusts her charming uncle Andrew to handle their estate. But her grief blinds her to his schemes, and soon, she realizes he's stolen everything: her inheritance, her family home, and her father's business. Left with nothing, Emma hits rock bottom until she discovers Andrew's empire is built on lies, fraud, and a dangerous gambling addiction. Fueled by rage and a thirst for justice, Emma devises a meticulous plan to take him down. She infiltrates his world, uncovers his darkest secrets, and dismantles his carefully crafted image piece by piece. But as Andrew's life crumbles, Emma discovers an even bigger scandal that implicates powerful figures and puts her own safety at risk. When Andrew vanishes under mysterious circumstances, Emma is left wondering, has she won, or has her enemy outsmarted her one final time? This is a gripping tale of betrayal, revenge, and the high-stakes cost of justice. I never thought betrayal could cut this deep. People talk about heartbreak, about the pain of losing someone you love, but no one warns you about the kind of agony that comes from being stabbed in the back by your own family. When my parents died in a car accident, I was 21 years old and completely unprepared for what would come next. Grief consumed me, and I had no idea that while I was drowning in it, my uncle Andrew was circling like a shark, waiting for his opportunity. Andrew was my father's younger brother and the last person I'd have suspected of turning on me. He was always around when I was growing up, joking with my dad, slipping me cash for ice cream when my mom wasn't looking. When my parents were killed, he was the one who held my hand at the funeral, the one who told me I wasn't alone, that I'd always have him to lean on. At a time when my world had shattered, Andrew felt like a lifeline. The first few weeks after my parents' deaths were a blur. Between the funeral arrangements, the endless condolences from distant relatives, and the crushing weight of their absence, I barely had the energy to function. Andrew stepped in like a hero. He told me to focus on healing and leave the boring legal stuff to him. That's what family is for, he'd said, his hand resting on my shoulder in a way that felt reassuring. I trusted him. What I didn't realize was that trust can be a weapon. It started with the paperwork. Andrew told me my parents had left behind a solid inheritance, our family home, a significant savings account, and my father's 30% share in the small construction business he co-owned with a partner. It wasn't enough to make me rich, but it would have given me a stable foundation. I didn't understand any of the legal jargon, so when Andrew slid a stack of documents across the table and said, "Just sign here, it's for the estate," I didn't even think twice. I signed every page he put in front of me. Looking back, I want to scream at my younger self. I was so naive, so blind to the warning signs. But at the time, I didn't question a thing. Andrew had been nothing but kind to me. Why would I? For a while, everything seemed fine. I moved out of my parents' house, it was too painful to stay there, and rented a small apartment. Andrew handled the sale of the house, promising me the money would be transferred to my account once everything was finalized. I waited. Weeks turned into months, and the money never came. Every time I asked about it, Andrew had an excuse. The market's slow, he'd say, or there's some red tape to sort out. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Then, one day, I decided to visit the house. It had been 6 months since I left, and I felt this strange pull to see it again. But when I pulled into the driveway, something was off. There were lights on inside, and an unfamiliar car parked out front. Confused, I knocked on the door. A man in his 40s answered, holding a mug of coffee and wearing a bathrobe. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyeing me warily. "This is my parents' house," I said, the words sticking in my throat. "Who are you?" The man frowned. "I bought this house 6 months ago. Are you sure you have the right address?" The world tilted beneath me. I stood there, speechless, as he closed the door. 6 months ago. That was right after I had moved out. Andrew had sold the house without telling me, without giving me a single cent of the proceeds. That was the moment the first crack appeared in the facade of trust one had built around Andrew. I called him immediately, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me you sold the house? Where's the money, Andrew?" He didn't even try to deny it. "Relax, kid," he said, his tone patronizing. The money's tied up in some investments right now. It's better this way. You're too young to be handling that kind of cash. You'd blow it all in a year. I was stunned. That money was mine. My parents left it for me, not you. And I'm making sure it doesn't go to waste, he snapped. You should be thanking me. I hung up, my hands trembling. For the first time, I began to realize just how badly I had been played. But the worst was yet to come. Over the next few weeks, I started digging. I requested copies of the legal documents from my parents' estate and went through them with the help of a lawyer I couldn't really afford. What I found made my stomach churn. I had unknowingly signed over power of attorney to Andrew, giving him complete control over my inheritance. The house, the savings, my dad's share in the business, he had taken it all. When I confronted him again, he didn't even bother with excuses. You signed the papers, he said, his smirk making me want to punch him. It's all perfectly legal. He was right. Legally, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't prove he had manipulated me into signing those documents, and even if I could, I didn't have the resources to fight him in court. I was broke, living paycheck to paycheck, while Andrew was living in my parents' house and driving a brand new luxury car. Welcome to the real world, kid, he said when I demanded he give me back what was mine. This is how it works. You've got to be smart to survive, and frankly, you're just not. I don't know what hurt more, the fact that he had stolen from me, or the way he dismissed me as if I were nothing. For weeks, I sank into a deep depression. The betrayal weighed on me like a stone, and the helplessness was suffocating. Every time I thought about my parents, about how hard they had worked to provide for me, I felt like I had failed them. I could almost hear my dad's voice in my head, telling me to stand up for myself, to fight back. But how? Andrew had all the power, all the money. I had nothing. That was when I realized something: Andrew wasn't invincible. He wasn't some untouchable mastermind. He was just a man, a greedy, arrogant man with weaknesses like anyone else. And if I couldn't fight him in court, I'd find another way to make him pay. Revenge wasn't just an option. It was my only option. I spent weeks mulling over my next steps, replaying every interaction with Andrew in my head, analyzing every word he'd said, every smug look he'd given me. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became: I couldn't let him get away with what he'd done. But I couldn't afford to act recklessly. If I wanted to take him down, I needed to be smart. This wouldn't just be about confronting him. No, I needed to destroy the very thing that gave him power: his reputation, his business, his life. The first step was information. I needed to learn everything I could about Andrew's life and his business. He owned a construction company, the one my father had co-founded and worked so hard to build. I barely knew anything about it, apart from the fact that it was doing well, very well. Andrew had expanded it significantly after my father's death. Of course, I now knew how. He used the money he'd stolen from me to grow the business. That knowledge made my blood boil, but it also gave me an idea. I started with what I could find online. Andrew was proud of his success and wasn't shy about flaunting it. His social media accounts were filled with photos of luxury vacations, expensive cars, and fancy dinners. He even posted about the company's achievements, new contracts, completed projects, awards. I noticed something interesting as I scrolled through his posts: he seemed to rely heavily on government contracts. Most of the projects he boasted about were tied to public infrastructure, roads, schools, and government buildings. Government contracts meant oversight, regulations, and audits. If there were any skeletons in Andrew's closet, I had a feeling I'd find them there. But social media only gave me surface-level information. I needed more. I needed to see how Andrew's company operated, how it made its money, and whether it was cutting corners to do so. That's when I came up with a bold plan. I decided to get a job at a company that partnered with his. It wasn't as difficult as I expected. Andrew's construction company frequently worked with a local engineering firm, one that was hiring for administrative positions. My resume wasn't impressive, but I had just enough experience in office work to land a job as an administrative assistant. The pay was terrible, and the work was mind-numbing, but I didn't care. It was a means to an end. From my new vantage point, I began to piece together the inner workings of Andrew's business. The engineering firm often collaborated with him on bids for government contracts, which meant I had access to critical information, contracts, budgets, and emails. It didn't take long to notice some glaring red flags. Andrew was cutting corners everywhere he could. He underpaid workers, skimped on materials, and manipulated numbers to make his bids more competitive. On paper, everything looked clean, but once you dug deeper, it was obvious that his projects were riddled with safety violations and shoddy workmanship. It was infuriating to see how reckless he was, how little he cared about the people who worked for him or the communities he was supposedly serving. I documented everything. I forwarded incriminating emails to myself, took photos of questionable budgets, and even compiled testimonials from employees who were frustrated with Andrew's practices. But I wasn't ready to strike just yet. I wanted to gather as much evidence as possible, enough to completely ruin him when the time came. And then, I stumbled upon something even bigger. One night, as I was combing through financial records, I noticed a series of payments that didn't make sense. They were small amounts, spread out over several months, and labeled as miscellaneous expenses. At first, I thought they might be bribes. Andrew was just the kind of person who would grease palms to get what he wanted. But the truth was even worse. I started cross-referencing the payments with Andrew's personal accounts, which I'd found access to through some old emails he'd left unguarded. That's when I discovered his dirty little secret. Andrew had a gambling problem. He wasn't just gambling casually, he was deep into it. Casinos, online betting sites, underground poker games. The payments I'd found were being funneled to cover his losses. The debts were staggering, and it was clear he'd been using money from the company to pay them off. This was the crack I'd been waiting for. Andrew had always been careful to maintain an image of success and stability. His clients trusted him because they believed he was reliable, professional, and in control. If word got out about his gambling addiction and the way he was siphoning money from his own company, it would destroy him. But I wasn't going to expose him just yet. Not without setting up the perfect chain reaction. I started laying the groundwork for his downfall. First, I reached out to a journalist at a well-known newspaper, pretending to be a whistleblower from within Andrew's company. I provided just enough information to pique their interest, documents showing unsafe working conditions and evidence of cost-cutting measures that compromised the integrity of his projects. I knew it wouldn't take long for them to dig deeper and uncover even more dirt. Next, I began feeding information to his competitors. I created an anonymous email account and sent them tips about Andrew's fraudulent practices. It was risky, but I knew it would create ripples. Once his competitors started sniffing around, they'd start questioning how he'd managed to secure so many lucrative contracts. Finally, I decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, his creditors. Using the financial records I'd uncovered, I contacted one of the loan sharks he owed money to. I framed it as a concerned tip from someone who knew Andrew's financial situation, suggesting that he was hiding assets to avoid paying his debts. It didn't take long for the sharks to come circling. Within weeks, the cracks in Andrew's empire began to show. The journalist published an exposé detailing the shady practices at his construction sites, complete with damning photos and anonymous testimonials. The story went viral, sparking outrage and prompting an investigation by local authorities. Andrew's competitors jumped at the chance to discredit him, and several of them began filing complaints about his business practices. Suddenly, the contracts that had seemed so secure were being reviewed, and the steady stream of money that had been flowing into his accounts began to dry up. But the loan sharks were the final blow. They started showing up at his office, intimidating his staff, and demanding their money. Clients began pulling out of projects, unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation was now in tatters. Through it all, I stayed in the shadows, watching as Andrew's world unraveled. I didn't feel guilty, not for a second. This was the justice he deserved, the justice my parents deserved. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final card to play, and I intended to use it at just the right moment. As Andrew's empire began to crumble, I watched from the sidelines with a mixture of satisfaction and grim determination. Every new headline about his failures, every whispered rumor circulating through the industry, every panicked phone call he made to salvage his reputation was a step closer to justice. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Not until he truly understood the depth of his betrayal and felt the weight of his own actions crashing down on him. Despite the chaos I'd unleashed, Andrew refused to admit defeat. That was his nature, cocky, self-assured, and convinced of his own invincibility. Even as government audits began picking apart his contracts and the loan sharks loomed closer, he kept pretending he had everything under control. He started posting less on social media, his usual extravagant lifestyle giving way to vague, deflective updates about challenges and business setbacks. But I could see the cracks forming. He was desperate, scrambling to hold on to the illusion of power. I decided it was time to make my next move. Through my job at the engineering firm, I had learned that Andrew was trying to secure a last-ditch project, a massive government contract to build a new highway. If he landed the deal, it could buy him enough time to recover from the damage I'd caused. It would keep his company afloat and restore some of the credibility he'd lost. I couldn't let that happen. Using my insider access, I found the contact information for the project manager overseeing the bidding process. I drafted an anonymous letter, attaching copies of the evidence I had collected about Andrew's shady practices, falsified safety reports, inflated budgets, and evidence of underbidding to win contracts. I made sure to emphasize how dangerous it would be to award a public project to someone with such a track record. The next day, I overheard whispers in the office that Andrew's bid had been disqualified. One of the other firms had swooped in and taken the contract. Another victory. But Andrew wasn't just losing business, he was losing allies, too. The loan sharks I had tipped off were relentless. They weren't just after their money, they wanted to send a message. I learned through mutual acquaintances that they had begun harassing Andrew at his home, showing up unannounced and threatening to escalate things if he didn't pay up. The stress was clearly getting to him. He wasn't showing up at industry events anymore, and I heard through the grapevine that some of his top employees had quit, unwilling to deal with the fallout. Still, Andrew was nothing if not stubborn. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. He began liquidating assets to cover his debts, selling off company equipment, downsizing his operations, even putting my parents' house on the market. That house, the one he'd stolen from me, was the last thread tying him to the success he had built on lies. I couldn't let him walk away with a profit from it. This was when I decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, his reputation in the community. Andrew had spent years cultivating an image of a self-made man, a philanthropist who gave back to the community. It was all a sham, of course, but people believed it. I knew that if I could expose him publicly, in front of the very people who had admired him, it would be the final nail in his coffin. Using the contacts I'd made through my job, I arranged for a town hall meeting to discuss the impact of recent scandals in the construction industry. It was the perfect trap. Andrew, desperate to save face, showed up to the meeting, hoping to spin the narrative in his favor. He walked in wearing his usual smug expression, as if he still believed he could talk his way out of anything. But this time, he wasn't in control. The journalist I'd worked with was there, armed with even more damning evidence that had come to light since their first exposé. Community members began to speak up, recounting stories of unfinished projects, unsafe buildings, and workers who had been injured on Andrew's sites due to his cost-cutting measures. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of fear in Andrew's eyes. He tried to defend himself, but his excuses fell flat. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Then, I made my move. I stood up, my heart pounding, and addressed the room. "I'd like to share something about Andrew's business practices," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. All eyes turned to me, including Andrew's. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize me. But as I began to speak, as I recounted how he had stolen my inheritance and manipulated me into signing away everything my parents had left behind, his face went pale. "This man," I said, pointing directly at him, "is a fraud. He built his success on lies, theft, and the exploitation of others. He stole from me, his own family, and he'll do the same to anyone who trusts him." The room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers, and Andrew looked like a cornered animal. He tried to deny everything, but the damage was done. His reputation, the one thing he had relied on to maintain his position in the community, was in tatters. After the meeting, I walked out into the night, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a deep sense of closure. For the first time since my parents' deaths, I felt like I had taken back some of the power Andrew had stolen from me. But there was still one final step to take. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Andrew needed to be held accountable, not just in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law. And I had one last ace up my sleeve. In the weeks after the town hall meeting, Andrew's life unraveled faster than even I could have anticipated. His company collapsed under the weight of lawsuits, fines, and cancelled contracts. He was blacklisted from bidding on future government projects, his remaining employees quit, and the loan sharks continued circling, more aggressive than ever. The man who once smirked down at me as though I were nothing was now a shadow of himself. I thought I'd won. But life has a way of throwing unexpected twists, even when you think the story is over. One morning, I received an email from a name I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Suspicious but curious, I clicked on it. Inside was a link to a secure folder with dozens of files, photos, videos, and documents. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. But as I scrolled through the images, my heart sank. The files detailed years of illegal activities far worse than anything I had uncovered about Andrew's business practices. Bribes to government officials to win contracts. Payoffs to inspectors to ignore safety violations. Under-the-table deals with contractors to inflate budgets and split the extra cash. And then there were the photos, Andrew in private meetings with prominent local politicians, envelopes of cash exchanging hands, construction materials being diverted to side projects that weren't part of the official plans. It was an entire web of corruption, and Andrew was at the center of it. At first, I thought the email was a hoax, some elaborate prank designed to scare me. But the more I looked through the files, the clearer it became that they were real. And the person who sent them? A disgruntled former employee of Andrew's who had been fired and blacklisted from the industry. The sender explained in the email that they had been holding on to the evidence for years, hoping to one day use it as leverage against Andrew. But after seeing his recent downfall in the news, they decided it was time to share the truth. This changed everything. I had thought Andrew's destruction was complete. I thought I'd taken everything from him. But this evidence opened the door to something much larger, a scandal that would take down not just Andrew, but powerful figures in local government as well. The same politicians who had praised him publicly and handed him lucrative contracts were now implicated in his crimes. I sat with the information for days, unsure what to do. Part of me felt vindicated. This was proof that Andrew's entire empire had been a lie from the very beginning. But another part of me hesitated. If I released this information, it would spark a political and legal firestorm. People I didn't even know would be caught in the fallout. And Andrew? This would destroy what little remained of his life. But hadn't he destroyed mine first? I decided to act. Instead of going to the authorities directly, I reached out to the same journalist who had written the exposés about Andrew's unsafe business practices. I sent them the files anonymously, along with a note, "This is just the beginning. Dig deeper." I knew they would handle it carefully, ensuring the story was airtight before it went public. Within a week, the story broke. The headline was splashed across every local newspaper and news site, "Construction Kingpin and Politicians Exposed in Multi-million-dollar Corruption Scandal." The articles detailed every sordid detail, the bribery, the fraud, the negligence. Andrew's face was plastered everywhere, alongside photos of the politicians he'd colluded with. It wasn't just a local story anymore, it made national news, drawing attention to the systemic corruption in our city. But the most shocking part? The investigation revealed that Andrew's financial troubles weren't just due to his gambling addiction. He had been funneling money to a secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars had disappeared, and when the authorities tried to track it down, they found that Andrew had recently transferred the funds, completely draining the account. He'd been planning his escape. I thought I'd ruined him completely, but Andrew had one last trick up his sleeve. The day after the story broke, Andrew disappeared. The loan sharks, the investigators, the journalists, none of them could find him. His house was empty, his phone disconnected, and his car abandoned at the airport. Security footage showed him boarding a private jet, but the flight logs had been falsified. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. For weeks, the city buzzed with rumors. Some said he'd fled to South America, others claimed he was hiding in Europe. A few whispered that he might even be dead, taken out by the same loan sharks he had been running from. But I knew better. Andrew wasn't the type to give up. He was too proud, too arrogant. Wherever he was, he'd be plotting his comeback, just as he plotted to steal everything from me all those years ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I found a better job, one that paid well enough to help me start rebuilding what I'd lost. The chaos Andrew had caused in the community began to settle, though the politicians who'd been implicated in his schemes were still under investigation. And then, one night, I received another email. This one had no subject line and no text in the body. Just a single attachment, a photo. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. It was a picture of a beach, somewhere tropical, with turquoise water and white sand. Sitting at a table under a thatched umbrella was Andrew. He was dressed in a linen shirt and sunglasses, holding a drink with a little paper umbrella in it. He looked relaxed, even happy. But it was the smirk on his face that sent a chill down my spine. The same smug, arrogant smirk he'd worn every time he'd lied to me. At the bottom of the photo was a handwritten note, "Nice try, kid. Better luck next time." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling with rage. After everything I'd done, after all the pain and humiliation he'd caused, Andrew had escaped, free and untouched. For a moment, I felt defeated. But then, I realized something. Andrew might have run away, but he was a fugitive now. His name was tarnished, his business gone, his reputation destroyed. He had lost everything that mattered, and all he had left was his money. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. Let him run. Let him hide. Because no matter where Andrew went, no matter how far he fled, he'd always be looking over his shoulder. And one day, when he least expected it, I'd be there. Waiting. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.